Welcome to Dire Straits. I'm Amanda Monty.
I'm Tracy Clark-Flory.
Today, our episode is all about our very own Tracy Clark-Flory's newest book, My Mother's Daughter, out May 5th from Gallery Books. The book has been called a tender, revelatory, and deeply moving story by one Amanda Monty. That's me. My Mother's Daughter is a memoir of family secrets, sisterhood, traumatic inheritance, and the importance of untangling all that our mothers pass down. It received starred reviews from both Booklist and Kirkus, which called it deeply researched and lyrically written, trenchant and moving, and a powerful rejection of white male-dominated systems of oppression. Let's go. She's also got glowing blurbs from Rebecca Traister, Arin Carmone, Peggy Orenstein, Koa Beck, Soraya Shamali, Savala Nolan, and Liz Lenz.
Oh my God, I'm squirming. For a memoirist, I am so uncomfortable with people talking about me, but I should probably get used to that.
Yes, you should, because it's going to be happening a lot. We are recording this episode just before the book's release, so we'll also get into all the behind-the-scenes questions about how Tracy is feeling about publishing such an honest, unflinchingly feminist book in an era of backlash and hyper-masculine authoritarianism.
Yeah, I don't know if the mark of success these days is a New York Times bestseller or getting on a banned book list.
Definitely the latter. This episode is totally free because we want everyone and literally their mother to know about Tracy's book. You should, however, immediately grab a copy of My Mother's Daughter wherever you get your books. It is officially out Tuesday, May 5th, but if you have not yet heard, pre-orders mean everything to a book's success. It's kind of crazy. Ordering a book before it comes out has such a huge impact on a book's success and an author's future career. We want to support you, Tracy.
Please?
So, no pressure, but actually, please just pause this episode right now and go pre-order the book. And while you're at it, grab a copy for your mom, your sister, maybe even a man in your life, because men should also read.
Men should read, period, and they should especially read this book. Remember also to please rate us on your podcast apps and to share the episode with everyone you know and on your socials. You can and should also join our Substack community at direstraitspod.com. That's Straits with a GH. Paid subscribers get all of our episodes, no paywalls ever, along with special bonus episodes and subscriber chats.
Okay, Tracy, let's start with just a general recap of what this book is about. Specifically, tell us how you found out that you had a sister.
Okay, so I first found out that I had a sister when I was a teenager. It was shortly after I went on birth control, which I feel was very relevant to my mom's decision to tell me at that point. She sat me down and she told me that she had to tell me something really serious. And I could tell from the look on her face that this was something that was going to change everything. And it was. She told me that when she was a teenager, she had gotten pregnant and that her father sent her away to a home for unwed mothers. It was the 60s. It was the Midwest. I remember her comparing it to, she said it was like a camp for pregnant girls. Then she told me that my sister was Black, that her father was Nigerian, that she had met him at college. I had grown up as an only child, longing for a sister. And so here, all of a sudden, I was discovering that I already had one somewhere out there in the world. The only question that I asked my mom at that time was, do you ever wonder about her? And she said, I think about her every day of my life. And then we barely spoke of it again. It was a while after that I found out a little bit more about her experience, that she had actually ended up being committed to a mental institution in the wake of the adoption. So it was one of those things where there was like this big revelation of this family secret. and then, subsequent revelations. It was a revelation that totally rocked my world. But there wasn't a lot of space to process it, to hear more about my mom's experience. It was obviously something that caused her a lot of pain. It also brought up a lot of questions for me about where my sister was, how she was doing. And I think also seeded some questions for me around, the fact that my mom had placed a baby for adoption, that she had a daughter out there in the world. There was a little bit of a question of could you have placed me for adoption? It sort of raised these questions about our connection. So it was this, as with so many revelations of family secrets, it was this huge moment, and then it kind of was quietly put back in the closet.
Yeah. I'm so curious how it felt to live with that knowledge and not talk about it after that for so long, given how much it affected you when you learned what had happened. And also, how long after your mom died did you decide that this was part of her past, of your family history that you wanted to explore?
Yeah, I mean, I thought of my sister often. I think that while my mom was alive, I felt like it was something that she owned. Because I'd asked, I remember her saying that she had listed herself on an adoption registry so that if her daughter ever tried to come and find her, that hopefully she would be able to find her. This was before DNA testing was popularized. And so I think there was a part of me that for most of my life was waiting for our phone to ring at the house that I grew up at, because I knew that it had been listed on this registry and that any day my sister might come calling. But she never called. And I never felt like it was my right to sort of go looking for her on my own. And my mom was really adamant that she didn't want to, for example, hire a private detective, which is what some people have done, to find babies that they place for adoption in that era, because she didn't want to barge into her life. I remember her saying very clearly that it was not her right, as she put it, that she felt like she had made this decision, she had signed the papers, and that she didn't want to disrupt her daughter's life. But then after my mom died, my dad disconnected the landline at my childhood home. And my very first thought was, she can't find us now. And so I listed my own phone number on an adoption registry so that she could find me, because I had this sense of I am the only sort of connection to our mom. I would be the person now that has to share the story with her if she's looking to know more about the circumstances of her adoption. I didn't hear anything after that. And then one day, in the spring of 2022, I was sitting in my backyard with my very good friend having coffee, and she was telling me that she had just taken a DNA test and uncovered a family secret totally unexpectedly. She was just in it for some, genealogical fun. And then her world got totally rocked. And I realized that this could be a way to find my sister. I'd seen the headlines over the years, but this was the thing that really drove it home for me. And so I ordered a test right then and there, and, spit in a vial, dropped it in a mailbox, and 2 weeks later, I get my DNA results in my inbox.
And the rest
after
is history.
all this time. Yes.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that you and I really became work wives after you wrote the book, as you were finishing the book. So I read the book. I know the story. But I thought we could talk today a little bit about how the book emerged as a book for you. I know you released your first memoir, Want Me, in 2021. Perfect time for a book release at the height of the pandemic. We're hoping this one is better.
I mean, it's not looking great so far, but yeah.
Right. I mean, the
There's
world
a lot going on in the world.
Keeps getting better.
Yeah, no pandemic so far. Knock on wood. Literally knocking on wood right now.
Yes. But can you kind of break down for us, how did the previous release of your book and the DNA test and the
Yeah.
loss of your mom, like sort of what was the timeline there? And,
Yeah.
when did you start realizing that this was a book?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because I feel like the first book was really part of what kind of cleared the way for me to try to find my sister and to start looking into my mom's past, because Want Me was looking back at my young adulthood, my upbringing. A lot of it was kind of wrestling with like my relationship with my dad and like how that influenced my ideas about me as a woman and about men more generally. And my mom was also in there and was significant, and I even mentioned in that book the conversation we had about my sister because it felt so relevant to a story about my sexual coming of age that, like, as I was just about to start having sex, my mom shared this story almost as like a cautionary tale, right? Of like what could happen, of not wanting history to repeat itself. But I really hadn't kind of seen the significance of her, of like the connection of her story to my story. And so it was really, I treated it much more as a footnote. And I think there was a way in which after I finished Want Me, it was like a first round of processing of my life, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think I'd unpacked a lot of stuff about gender and desire and power. And I wrote it as I wrote the proposal for Want Me as I was pregnant and then immediately postpartum. Because I'd gotten laid off when I was 8 months pregnant. And that kind of segued into like, oh, okay, I guess I'm going to write that book now. And so like literally wrote that book with like my 1 month old laying on my chest, in the dark, just, with the glow of my computer screen.
As mothers do.
As mothers do, sometimes it involved my sweet child pooping on my leg and me continuing to write because it's what you have to do. But so I was like entering into motherhood. I was becoming a mom, a motherless mom, because my mom had died years earlier. And I had just done that first round of processing. And I do think that there's a lot about putting that book into the world, becoming a mother myself, that like positioned me to be able to consider my mom's story and to empathize with it, to like really want to look at it as a mother now myself. So I took the DNA test. I like very shortly thereafter, like within minutes, sent out a message to my half sister, Kathy. And within hours we were on the phone together. So everything happened very quickly. And during that first phone call, Kathy started to ask about the basics of what I knew. And I realized how little I knew, actually. I had this basic sketch of like, the Midwest in the 60s, that her father was Nigerian. My mom had mentioned that he was captain of the soccer team at college. But that was like about all that I had. And so for so much of my life, I had worried about my sister, like what happened to her? Is she okay? But my sister in that phone call told me that she'd been raised by wonderful adoptive parents. She described herself as blessed. And so it was like through this combination of realizing that both my sister was okay and that I knew so very little about the circumstances of her adoption that I started to actually ask questions about what had happened to our mom back in 1965.
Right. Yeah. And we should say in the book, you recount so beautifully, you developing a relationship with Kathy and sort of the complications of that and all the questions that, were swirling for you at the time, sort of, what is a sister when you've been separated for so long?
Yeah.
And so again, everyone should go read the whole book and get the whole story. But what sort of comes into the book then is these questions about these homes for unwed mothers and that history, which you also sort of break down so beautifully and really put it in context in terms of what's happening with women's reproductive rights today. I learned so much about that history from the book. I'm curious how much you knew about the history of these homes before you wrote the book.
So little. I will admit that when I wrote Want Me, I like downloaded the ebook preview of one of these histories of homes for unwed mothers just to get a basic sense of like, what were these homes, right? Like I hadn't ever really looked into it. But then after talking to Kathy, books about homes for unwed mothers started to pile up on my desk. I started to very obsessively research. And I very quickly realized that my understanding of my mom's teenage pregnancy was all wrong. Just completely wrong. I'd seen the adoption as a difficult personal choice and a result of like the times. But the more I learned about these homes, the more I realized that these institutions coerced and even forced women into adoption. Often the choice of adoption was made for them by their parents, oftentimes. And I realized that these homes were part of a system designed to promote marriage and the white middle-class nuclear family norm. These unwed mothers, most of them white, were across the years called prostitutes, sluts, promiscuous, bad girls, rebels. As soon as their pregnancies started to show, their, dangerous unmarried sexuality was hidden behind the walls of these homes. They were literally sent away so that, their suburban neighborhoods didn't have to reckon with the evidence of their unmarried sexuality. And nobody was told, there were like lies were told about daughters staying with, an aunt who lived across the country, that kind of thing. And then once they gave birth, they were pushed towards placing their babies for adoption. Then they were supposed to return to their normal lives and pretend that the pregnancy had never happened, to just forget and move on. And they were really sold this lie that it was possible to do that. And the idea was that these homes were giving women another chance at becoming proper women and wives and mothers. And so I started to see this connection between my mom being sent away in shame and the fact that I had dedicated so much of my career to writing about sex as a personal essayist and as a journalist covering the sex beat, going to all these taboo places. I started to realize that I had been writing against what had been done to my mom, that she had been sent away in shame. And then here I am, in many ways, devoting my career to shame. And I started to realize the ways that I had sort of inherited her shame, that my job required me to confront shame over and over and over again, but I never actually escaped it. And so it was these two realizations together, that I had my mom's story all wrong and that I was in many ways still trapped in her story, where I was like, oh my God, I think this is a book. And at that point, I was still very much living the story. It was unfolding and totally uncertain. But I felt pulled to piece it all together, both her story, my story, and our story, right? And so I started recording what was happening and taking notes and trying to write my way through it and make sense of it, because that's what I do in this life, I was in, what felt like one of the wildest and like most cosmic moments of my life. And I needed to record it.
Well, and I'm so glad that we're finally talking about this history because it does feel like it is one that has been secreted away in shame, not just within families, but sort of culturally, right? Like it's kind of like the other side of the anti-abortion movement, right? Is this taking away of women's children.
Yeah.
I was just rewatching Mad Men and their Peggy gives up
Yeah.
her child. It's a little
Yep.
bit more of a choice for her in the sense that she doesn't want to have a child, she
Yeah.
wants to be a career woman. But I was also thinking of you when I watched recently, there's a new Cillian Murphy, or I guess it came out in 2024, film, Small Things Like These, which is also about homes for unwed mothers in Ireland. And I know Kate Schatz also has a new novel out
Yes.
that sort of covers this history, and
Yeah.
she also has a personal connection to it, right, through her mother as well.
Yes, yeah. So her book is called Where the Girls Were. It's fantastic. We're doing all these amazing overlapping events and stuff together because our books are being pubbed 2 months apart. So her book is a novel, but she was inspired to write it because her mom was sent away as a young pregnant woman. And what's interesting to me is that she had been working on that book for I think like 10 years in total or more even. So it was a long process for her. But she mentioned that the Dobbs decision in 2022 was part of what made her realize like, oh no, this is really a book. This has to happen. This is very relevant. And at the same time, it was 2022, spring of 2022, that I found my sister, took the DNA test, found my sister, and set off on this whole journey to understand my mom's past. And so the overturn of Roe was the just uncanny backdrop to my falling into this research about the past, right? At the same time that it felt like we were all collectively hurtling back in time. And so it's interesting to me that like, you have stuff is burbling up, right, about this era. The fact that you have these two books that are coming out around the same time. I believe there's like, I don't know if it's like a German term or something for this phenomenon of when people come up with the same idea, like, in different places around the globe at the same time, this way that like historical events, culture, etc., can just like kind of cause stuff to start burbling up. And I think it's definitely true that the Dobbs decision amplified this project for me, or like the importance of this project. It made it very clear that this was unfortunately extremely relevant and timely.
Yeah.
And so that helped to really like solidify the project for me.
Yeah, I mean, these stories are definitely coming up in pop culture. We are also recording this just, 2 days after Dolores Huerta issued a statement saying that she gave up 2 children. And, so it's interesting. It does feel very connected to Dobbs and the continued assault on women's reproductive rights, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But it also feels very much related to this kind of like post Me Too era that we're in right now with Epstein and all of these stories that are just coming forward about how deep these kind of secrets go. And you know what, Tracy? One thing I have never told you, or I don't even think shared publicly, is that my dad had a sibling that my grandmother gave up before he was ever born. And I don't actually know that much about the history. The secret, the family lore was that she left this child on a doorstep. I don't know that this is true. I don't know how much of this was coerced, was her choice.
Wow. Yes.
So, it's like how many families have stories like this?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
We just don't talk about.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many people who are touched by adoption. So many people, so many women who are carrying these secrets around. I mean,
Yeah.
one of my mom's closest friends was also sent away to a home for unwed mothers in that era, and it was like, that's a moment in the book where I'm, talking to, think of her as like an aunt, you know, talking to her about finding my sister, and then everything that I'm finding about this history of homes for unwed mothers, and coming to make all these realizations about what happened to my mom. And then she goes, I was sent away too. And I just I'd known that she had a baby as a teenager, but I didn't know that she had been sent away. And then she actually successfully fought, because she had the resources, to hire a lawyer to basically argue that the adoption was hadn't been finalized because the baby's father hadn't signed the paperwork. And she was able to fight to get her baby back, right? So it was this very unusual story. But just to find that she had been sent away too, it made me feel like these stories are just out there everywhere. And they're like with so many things about, I think, motherhood in general, and pregnancy, you have an experience, whether it's having a miscarriage or something like that, and then suddenly you mention it, and then it's everyone's oh, me too. There is this aspect of me too, of where you're tapping into this shared experience, and this secrets start to surface, and you realize how widespread it is.
Right. And I mean, I think that's something that you cover so beautifully in the book. It is a personal story. It's a family story. It's very narratively driven, but you're also looking at the much bigger, broader cultural and political landscape and history. I wonder if we can talk a little bit more about shame, because one of the things that I love about the book, and of course you as a person, is how you connect, your mom's history and your mom's experience with your own work. And you mentioned that a little bit. But as somebody who writes about sex and sexuality and even has a podcast about these topics, right? I wonder if writing the book kind of solidified that connection for you, that kind of desire to fight back against that history of erasure and shame and silencing.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny to me now in retrospect that I didn't make this connection, because it seems so obvious. But it was really only in reading these histories that I started to go, oh, wait. For example, the first viral personal essay that I wrote was when I was 23, and it was titled "In Defense of Casual Sex." It was a defense of premarital sex, essentially, which was the same act that had gotten my mom sent away, gotten her baby taken away from her, left her traumatized, fractured my family. It's so, and as soon as I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It was oh, you were writing against what was done to your mom, without even being aware of it. And as soon as I started to pull on that thread, all this other stuff started coming up. I was learning about how these homes initially started in their earliest days. The aim was to rescue sex workers initially. So many of these organizations started that way, where they would go to a red light district and try to rescue these women on the streets, right? And what they found was that these women, these sex workers, didn't want to be rescued.
Yeah.
And they literally went oh yeah, it turns out that a woman is not going to voluntarily give up her freedom unless she's really desperate and needs to. And so they redirected their attentions towards unwed mothers, because they were a more captive audience. That's, I believe, a direct quote. And I had spent so much of my life reporting on the porn industry, writing about sex worker rights, without really having a sense of why was I so passionate about this topic?
Mm-hmm.
I had a sense, right? Like I could give you a basic spiel of like why I thought it was important. And it would be like something about like the, sexual hypocrisy in our culture and yada, yada, yada. But that just made it so clear. Like there's like a direct line here. And I also realized that like one of the things that my career, including writing my sexual coming of age memoir, had done was it meant that I had to continually face off with shame. Because as much as I was, especially like in my 20s on the internet, like very sort of out there in sharing details about my sex life and personal essays, or, in writing about porn and visiting porn sets and stuff like that, I was pretty uncomfortable when the topic would come up in my quote unquote real life. So like, especially as a parent too, I found like, if a kid's birthday party, a fellow mom is like, what do you write about? Like saying sex, like I would turn red and get all flustered. And like sometimes I would find that I like couldn't even answer the question in my social life, like, what is your book about? Yeah. And so it was clear that I was like this continual confrontation with shame as though it was like exposure therapy, but it was exposure therapy that never took. Like I never got to a point where I was like, and now I am shameless, but that is what I was sort of going for. And so I found that like there were ways in which I was writing against what happened to my mom, but there were also ways in which I was also kind of trapped in this cycle of shame. I was like just repeatedly experiencing that over and over and over again. And I really do feel like making that connection and starting to realize how I was living in reaction to what had happened to my mom was part of how I started to actually feel like I got out of it, which isn't to say that I'm shameless, but like I do feel so much more free of that fluttery, red-faced, stuttering sort of response when it comes to talking about my work, because I see it within the context of like women being shamed for being sexual, and right. So now it's like if a mom at a birthday party asks me what I write about, like it doesn't feel like I have to feel uncomfortable about that, or I have to be ashamed of existing as a complex human being in this world.
Imagine
as
that.
a mother,
right.
And a
but
woman.
At the same time, it's like it's very relatable in the sense that like it's easier said than done to overcome the very intentional silencing and shaming of women and their sexuality and sex that has persisted for centuries and that is still embedded in patriarchy.
And is it like an intentional mechanism of control, right? Exactly. Like that's part of a system of punishment, Right. Homes for unwed mothers were also a system of punishment that were built on shame, right? And so these things are very intentional.
Right. Well, speaking of kind of the process of writing the book and perhaps of, sort of societally induced shame in order to keep you silent and controlled, you write about real people in this book.
Yeah.
Your husband, sister, dad, lots of real people that are in your life. Your aunts, right, appear in the book. Mm-hmm. I'm curious what you would say to memoirists who are also women who struggle with this question. This is a question that I get all the time from women writers, and I always remind them that I doubt that men agonize over this at all. It seems very, very tied to these questions of shame.
Yeah. I mean, I was very clear from the start as I was writing my little notes and observations as I was getting to know my sister that I would never write a book about what was unfolding unless my sister was fully and completely comfortable with it. And that was like pretty contrary to my experience with Want Me. Where I was writing about my early sex life. Mm-hmm. And I really felt very strongly like this was my experience, this is my story, and I get to tell it, even if, for example, some of the men in the book would rather that I not. I took, I think, very decent measures to anonymize people. But I also, I just felt so strongly like I get to tell this story. In this case, nothing was more important to me than my developing relationship with my sister Kathy. And very early on, as our family story kept unspooling in wild, truly wild ways that you will have to read the book to learn about, she said to me, Tracy, this is a book. You've got to write this story, like so directly. And I was like, I agree. I agree. This is a book. And so it was like an amazing blessing to have her blessing, and not just for her to be like okay with it, but to feel like really kind of invested in it and enthusiastic about it. I did though worry about how my dad would react to certain parts of the book. I do a lot of reckoning with my mom's dependence on substances, weed, alcohol, as a way to numb the pain of her loss from the adoption. And I wasn't quite sure how he would react to that, and how that would jibe with his own understanding of her and our family and their relationship, or her relationship to alcohol and weed. I never questioned whether I would include that stuff, but I did have to have a series of conversations with him about what I was processing on my own and coming to realize, so that he wasn't finding out about it when he read the book. And luckily, he was okay with those revelations. All of which is to say, I don't think there are any hard and fast rules. Each time that I've written a book, a memoir, it feels completely brand new. The process of determining who you need to reach out to beforehand, how much you want to show them of the work, whether you're asking for permission explicitly or simply notifying them. And I think to navigate those things well, it requires a combination of empathy and emotional dexterity and artistic clarity. Like, what stories are yours to tell, period? Where do you require permission? In what ways do you want to balance your artistic vision with other people's privacy and pain? And when is it balance and when is it undue sacrifice? And to your point, is there a gendered piece of this that is part of how women are socialized to take care of others, perhaps especially men that they're writing about?
Right, exactly. Where do your personal and political sort of ethics come into the conversation?
Right.
Well, since we're talking crafty questions, I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to the braid of feminist theory and history and personal story in the book. I know that you love a map, Tracy, and you're so organized. So I was just getting ready for our conversation, thinking about, I wonder what all the little systems were that Tracy had for the book. I shouldn't say little, as I'm sure they were robust and intellectually.
Massive.
Yes.
Physically massive.
Yes.
And
mind altering. But tell us how you mapped and plotted all the arcs in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I love a map. It's true. I had sticky notes, real ones and digital ones.
Of course.
Index cards, dry erase boards, a bulletin board. I like to be able to see it visually. It is too much to hold in my head, all these different themes and time periods, especially for this book, what was happening back in 1965, what's happening right now. But then also I had scenes with my mom from when I was a teenager and recollections of conversations that we had in the past. So there was a lot of jumping around. And then also you have memoir mixed with reporting, mixed with feminist theory. So I storyboarded chapters much in the way that TV writers will map out an episode. And so something happens in each section of a chapter. The story is advanced in some way. And so I would reflect that in my little index cards. And I lived for years with index cards taped to the wall, spread out across the entire length of a room. And I remember every time that the heater would go on, the index cards would go flapping against the wall because they were only taped at the top. And it felt very poetic to me somehow, like this visual of the dancing outline on the wall. There's part of me that sees this kind of obsessive outlining as very helpful. I think it helped me to successfully build several different arcs across the book. But I also think it's part of what I want to call spiritual flailing. It's my discomfort with the unknown and what I cannot control. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to surrender to the work. I know that sounds corny, but it's true. I think that what happens is some combination of both artistic surrender and like type A, get her done business shit. And it's not always clear which you need or which is available at any given moment. And so I flail. I try to control it and map it. And then frequently I get so blocked with the controlling and mapping that I eventually just let myself write. And then, voila, magic, it all comes out, and all of it feels somehow essential to the process.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I also find like the outlining and mapping can sometimes just be a way to like run from yourself for a little bit, right? Like, maybe I just need to spend a week outlining because you're not ready to do whatever the next thing is. Okay, so let's talk about the critique of heterosexuality in the book because that's what we do here. And I think that critique is functioning on a few levels in the book. There's the critique of marriage and how it intersects with white and class privilege, but there's also a critique of the nuclear family, this sort of like limited singular vision of family, and how sort of holding on to that vision culturally and politically ends up institutionally harming women.
Yeah. I love that you separate out marriage and the nuclear family. No one else would do that, and it's so good to make that distinction.
I think you do that in the book. I think you should take credit.
Well, this is why we're friends and why we have a podcast together.
Our brains are enmeshed. We're fully codependent work wives now. Okay, so tell us about these critiques. Maybe we could start with the critique of marriage.
Yeah. So marriage was the aim of these institutions. These women, again, most of them white, could be repaired and reformed and turned into good wives. Mm-hmm. White women were seen as inherently good and pure. They had fallen from their pedestals by having premarital sex and getting pregnant. And these homes were a way to return them to their pedestals and to their privilege as white women. In fact, many of these homes actually conducted lessons in cooking and cleaning and sewing and social etiquette. They were very much training them to become what we would now call trad wives, right? And the aim was ultimately to contain white women's sexuality and reproductive capacities within marriage and the patriarchal household. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is all part of a broader history of marriage, as anyone who listens to this podcast hopefully already understands quite well, of, marriage being used as a tool for controlling women's sexuality and preserving white men's power and privilege and lines of inheritance. Black unwed mothers, on the other hand, were expected to raise their own children, in part because of racist stereotypes about Black women's hypersexuality. They were not put on a pedestal. So when Black women got pregnant outside of marriage, they were not seen as fallen women. When Black women tried to place their babies for adoption, they were actually threatened with charges of child abandonment. And so in then raising their own children, Black unwed mothers faced all sorts of associated costs, including lost education and lifelong poverty. Also, there were racist laws that targeted Black unwed mothers with surveillance and harassment, and welfare restrictions, also imprisonment and sterilization. And then the visibility of Black single mothers was then used to support campaigns for things like school segregation and restrictive public housing policies. So within this system, marriage was part of both oppressing white unwed mothers and helping them to regain their white privilege through marriage to white men.
Really, really fascinating history that really helps us understand how anti-single mother sentiments are always racist, racially coded. Okay, so then
Yes.
how did this kind of ideology play into the nuclear family and what these institutions were trying to do in terms of
Oh,
family?
man. Yeah. Well, the whole system was predicated on white unwed mothers placing their babies with white married couples who were struggling with infertility oftentimes. So if you want to put it in really stark and true terms, these women were treated as breeders for proper married couples who couldn't have biological children of their own. These women were traumatized by having their babies taken away from them in the interest of upholding that very American white picket fence myth.
Very Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, perfectly so. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Which is, of course, like the critique often of that story, right? That this actually has already happened in American
Oh my
history.
gosh. Well, and I think it is a history that most people are not familiar with, unless they lived through it themselves or somehow touched by that era of adoption. I mean, I think it's remarkable that it took me this long to really understand what these homes were as a feminist and someone with a mom who had been sent away, but that speaks, I think, to the way that shame and secrecy like really prevents that kind of knowing and understanding of history, right? Like the fact that my mom didn't actually really talk openly about this with me, the fact that she was so traumatized and in pain around this event from the past, which then led me to not really want to engage with her around it or ask questions, it helps to perpetuate that silence and secrecy. And, I think like there's a generational story here, right? Where like I came up really believing like the difference between my mom's story and mine, like the fact that she had been sent away in shame and that I was then, out here writing about premarital sex on the internet and going viral, that was like a testament to generational change. Whereas the understanding that I have now is that in many ways this whole story is a testament to how little has changed, right? And of course Dobbs is like a really strong underscoring of that.
Okay, so I'd love to talk through how this book fits into recent conversations we've seen through the years about marriage and motherhood, especially, since the pandemic. This book is about sisterhood and daughterhood. It's about the history of shame and coercion that we've discussed. It's also about motherhood, though. How do you see the book kind of tapping into or expanding on what quote unquote motherhood memoirs have done thus far?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in this book about my own motherhood. It's not front and center, but it's very much there as part of the background, and I think is very clearly an animating force. And I think like there are two main ways in which that shows up. And one is I write about, part of my sort of one of my many confrontations with shame is specifically around this idea of being a mother who writes about sex. And, part of how I was like able to move through some of my shame and kind of embrace that in my day-to-day life, when it's not just me on the internet, hiding behind my computer, is that I was able to see this as part of this very long history of trying to fracture, motherhood and sexuality, ironically, of course, right? And that there's a direct line of connection to my mom's story. And so I get into some of my discomfort around, having a child who's going to one day grow up and, confront the fact that his mom has a book titled Want Me, or that we have a bookshelf filled with, all sorts of crazy book titles. Also, the fact that I wrote so much of my first book with him strapped to my chest, right? So this like real embodiment of that divide, right? Writing about sex, having my baby strapped to my chest, really like reckoning with my sexual coming of age as I'm stepping into motherhood. And then the other piece is how my own motherhood was part of how I was able to really connect with what had happened to my mom. That as I was learning about the history of homes for unwed mothers, realizing how much coercion there was at play in these adoptions, coming to understand how so many of these women were left traumatized, and with pain for the rest of their lives, being able to connect with that as a mom, and in a lot of ways starting to grieve her lost motherhood now as a mother myself, because I'm able to connect to what it actually could mean to have your baby taken away from you, and then to go on with your life to try to pretend that it had never happened. Like, I was able to feel the sorrow of that in a way that I don't think I ever would have been able to do without having a child myself and having my own experience of motherhood.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought about reading the book, and thinking about it in the context of, quote unquote motherhood memoirs, is like, often the discourse about those books gets boiled down to like, is this a book that thinks motherhood is good or bad? And what I love about your book is that it's really reckoning with that traumatic inheritance, that, the intergenerational trauma that is embedded in motherhood under patriarchy. We all have, every woman has a mother with some kind of traumatic past, a mother who's been touched by patriarchal power. And, so your book, I feel like from the get-go, it sort of throws out that, like, we're not here to argue like pro, anti, right? But this is the shape of motherhood in this country. And that's why I think it's so important right now.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of like patriarchal trauma and like how that is passed down through generations of women. And I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of wifehood and marriage. Like, we talked about this in a recent pod episode, but, looking at my maternal grandmother's story of staying in a miserable marriage where she was hoping for her husband to die so that she would have a second chance at a happy life, and then my mom being sent away in shame, and redirected towards marriage. I really see this book as being in conversation with recent books that have questioned the structure of women's lives. And it happens that most of these books have been called divorce memoirs. And I think that it makes sense that we often see marriage being critiqued in the after, when a woman has left a marriage, as opposed to her critiquing that institution from the inside, which, I feel like is part of what I've done on this podcast with you, right?
Yeah, why do you think that is? Why do you think that it is so hard for other women to write critically about marriage from the inside?
Well, I think for so many reasons. Like, I think that if you're in a marriage where you're coming up against these like very prosaic sort of examples of inequity within a marriage, that it's hard to, put that on the internet or in a book or whatever. I think that in my case, it's challenging to know how to write about it or where to kind of go with it when my issue is not with my relationship. It's with the way that I have found myself within this institution that has, been historically oppressive, right? And continues to be oppressive. And, it's something I've been thinking about with, as we're recording this, the Lindy West memoir discourse is just like a blazing wildfire. And, there are a lot of people who are sort of critiquing her as a feminist. Like, this is what goes wrong when you try to, like, live your politics. Like, this idea that she's, like, forcing herself into polyamory as this, like, politically principled stance. I actually posted a TikTok about this recently where I was talking about my feelings of conflict over finding happiness within this institution that has fractured my family, and caused so much trauma. And all of the commenters were like, shut up. Like, be happy, enjoy your life. Like, I wish I had a husband that I liked, stuff like that. And so I don't know, it's like, I guess that's the difficulty for me, is like, where does one go with the critique if one's not actually, like, interested in ending a relationship, but you're more so like, I mean, I guess the answer for me is like that it's part of this, like, sort of ongoing conversation within my relationship. We will have conversations together about marriage as an institution, and we'll both be like, man, that shit is fucked up.
Right.
But also, I love you and I don't want to not be with you. And so it's more like, why are we together in this way? Isn't it funny and yet totally predictable and by design that we have found ourselves here? Yeah. And I don't know, what do we want to do with that critique? Remains to be seen, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're doing it. Like, you're writing this book. You're
whole ass book. This whole ass book. That's what I'm doing with it. God damn it.
I mean, you and your husband, like, weirdly do like each other, So, like,
so weird.
I think, sure, you could, like, my, like, fantasy of, like, well, what if all the women just got divorced and then they could stay with the men that they loved if they wanted.
Right.
But, I think probably more realistically, it's like a carbon offset thing, right? Like, you advocate for policies that don't privilege married people, right? Like, so it's so silly, like, these, jerks on the internet who are like, oh, just don't speak, right? Like, the answer actually is for Tracy to not talk and just, like, go canoodle with her husband. Like, I don't think that's the answer to centuries of oppression of women within the institution of marriage, So it's like,
right,
you're doing it.
I'm fine.
You're good. You're great.
My book is my contribution, okay?
We love you. You have a lot of contributions every day. So, I mean, we are obviously all in on the Tracy show right now for the next couple weeks as you're listening to this episode.
Yes.
Reminder to go pre-order the book, get copies for your friends, your husband if you have one, your ex-husband, your sister, definitely your mom and your grandmother.
Oh, my
and
goodness.
all the women in your life that have patriarchal trauma that you either do or don't know about. I just want to ask you, as we wrap up, how are you feeling with the book coming out? I mean, I think we might have to do, like, a full debrief episode and talk about,
we could do, like, a bonus ep.
Yeah, because, I mean, it's a crazy time to bring an honest feminist book into the world.
Yeah.
How long do you think it's going to be before this book is banned?
I don't know. I know. It's like, I've gone through the thing of like, ooh, wouldn't that be so exciting? It would feel like such a validation that I'm doing important work.
Exactly.
I mean, I feel very clear about the importance of this book, the relevance of this book, the timeliness of this book, which feels very unfortunate to me as well. Yeah. I wish it didn't feel so relevant. I wish I didn't, keep seeing new connection, like the Heritage Foundation report that we just did an episode about, which feels so deeply connected. It's like, there's just layers upon layers of relevance here that, are very unfortunate. I feel relieved that it's finally going to be out there.
Yeah.
It's just like, in the lead up to a book, there are so many unknowns. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm really in the worst period that one could be in right now. Like, I was talking to Kate Schatz, who's 2 months ahead of me, and she's, was feeling similarly ahead of her book publication. And now she's in the thick of it. It's been like a couple weeks that it's out there in the world. And now she's like, well, great. It's out there. Like, I'm doing stuff. I'm not just sort of like making notes about like all the things that I could be doing or should be doing to prepare for the launch. And she was comparing it to pregnancy and childbirth, like that when you're pregnant and you're preparing and you're making your list and you're trying to get all your ducks in a row, and then the baby arrives and you're just like, got to take care of that baby. And so I think this is the preparing and, perhaps illusion of control, spiritual flailing period.
Nesting, maybe.
Yes.
Getting the baby's
the
room
nesting.
Ready.
Yes. And then it's just going to be crazy taking care of a newborn book. I don't know.
Right. And then it's like your baby forever, and you just have to continue to take care of it until it turns 18. No, you never get a break.
You never get a break. You just have to keep promoting that book. Speaking of, I want to let listeners know that I'm going to have several book events coming up, and perhaps we'll be coming to a town near you. May 5th is my pub date. I'm also going to be doing a launch event at Mrs. Dalloway's in Berkeley, California, with Alexis Madrigal, who is maybe listening to this right now, subscriber of the pod. May 7th, I'm going to be at Books Are Magic in Brooklyn, New York, with Erin Carmone. May 14th, I'll be at Green Apple Books in San Francisco, California, with Savala Nolan. And then May 15th, I'll be at Skylight Books in Los Angeles with Koa Beck. So please come and say hi. I would love to see all of you IRL. Please do pre-order the book. It would mean so much to me. It really means everything for giving a book a chance at success. So
if you're going to buy it anyway, buy it the week before. It really, really matters.
Yeah.
And you are going to buy it anyway.